opportunity to cut through the waste, fraud, abuse, and falsehoods in Washington. Reconciliation provides us with a chance to address Washington's spending problem. Under the new Trump administration, we can cut spending, deliver on the mandate given to us by the American people, and put more money back in Americans' pockets. I thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I begin to yield back, I will await the false report on Medicaid in Michigan. I yield back.
Gentleman yields.
I want to disappoint the gentleman from Michigan, so I'm happy to inform him the accurate number that this bill would put 2.4 million people in Michigan at risk of losing Medicaid. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Washington State, distinguished former member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Jayapal.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, this bill is a Republican betrayal of the middle class, of working families across the country. If you are at home watching this, I want you to think about what Republicans want to slash from your life so that they can lower taxes for the biggest corporations and wealthiest billionaires like Elon Musk. They want to cut a minimum, the floor, of $880 billion from Medicaid, which covers health care for 72 million Americans. Medicaid pays for nursing homes for 5 out of 8 seniors across the country, pays for health care for 38 million kids, including over 3 million kids in Texas and 1.2 million kids in Ohio. In fact, it pays for 64% of childbirths in Speaker Mike Johnson and Majority Leader Steve Scalise's home state of Louisiana. Any Republican who votes for this resolution is voting for those cuts, as well as devastating cuts to nutrition and Medicare. Don't listen to Republicans who try to say that Medicaid won't be touched. I introduced an amendment to protect Medicaid, which they blocked during our budget markup because they intend to cut Medicaid. Remember when Donald Trump said that he would tackle inflation and lower costs on day one? Well, here we are, a month in, and prices are rising. Musk has taken a literal chainsaw to tens of thousands of jobs, putting families and local economies at risk. This budget resolution makes it clear that the only people that Republicans are willing to fight for in this country are the wealthiest billionaires who apparently now rule the country. This is unbridled greed and corruption. Vote no on this disastrous budget resolution. I yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to my good friend from the Cornhusker State of Nebraska, who is also chair of the Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee, Mr. Adrian Smith.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The American people want us to have a thoughtful exchange here, and I want to hopefully contribute to that, especially when I hear some of the accusations made that are just off base, misleading, false, and Warren Buffett has paid a record amount in taxes. I think that's worth noting. That's been in the press very widely in the last few days. But this budget framework delivers on House Republicans and the president's promise to minimize tax burdens for Americans across the income spectrum, promote security in our communities, and unleash economic growth. The resolution would allow us to extend the historic tax relief from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which has been enormously successful, and we know this, in allowing families to keep more of their paychecks and supercharging growth for small businesses. If these tax cuts are allowed to expire, as we've heard, the average American would suffer. Make no mistake, that's small businesses, family farms, so many other folks. In addition to averting the most severe tax hike in American history, this deficit-neutral budget will reduce the debt-to-GDP ratio by 8 percentage points. And the American people—
I'd like to yield another 15 seconds.
The American people, again, want us to have a thoughtful exchange on this. Let's elevate the debate and stick to the facts, and realizing we can do well for the American people by doing so. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserve. And you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would remind the gentleman this bill would put 340,000 people in Nebraska at risk of losing Medicaid. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Chu.
I rise in opposition to the Republican ripoff. Budgets tell priorities, and as inflation goes up and Americans continue struggling to pay their rent, purchase groceries, and afford going to the doctor, Republicans stand united. Sell out the working class by ripping away health care coverage and food from children to pay for tax cuts for the rich. This is the unbelievable but real cruelty of their budget. Make devastating cuts to Medicaid for 135,000, mostly seniors and children in my district alone. Slash SNAP benefits for thousands of hungry children and families. End ACA premium tax cuts that currently save families over $6,000 annually. And for what? To give $5 trillion in handouts to those who need it the least, the ultra-rich and big corporation. And let's be clear, my Republican colleagues will declare that this resolution is necessary to extending the 2017 Trump tax scam to purportedly help the middle class. This is a lie. The majority of the tax cuts that they aim to extend will only benefit the rich, and the middle class will lose so many of the benefits they rely on. In their 2017 Trump tax scam, Republicans slashed the corporate tax rate and watched 100% of those benefits flow to shareholders, billionaires, and high-paid executives. And what did workers get? A big fat zero. But even still, President Trump wants to cut the corporate tax rate by even more. What's more, Republicans' apparent concern for fiscal responsibility is nowhere to be found. Their budget will actually balloon our national debt in a reverse Robin Hood scheme that betrays working Americans we all represent.
Time has expired.
I'll yield the lady an additional 15 seconds.
My constituents deserve better. All of our constituents deserve better. I once again voice my opposition to the Republican ripoff that will do nothing to address the needs of everyday American people.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now yield 2 minutes to my good friend from Arkansas and the House Chair of the Financial Services Committee, Mr. French Hill.
Was recognized.
Thank the Speaker. I thank Mr. Arrington for yielding this time. What's irresponsible to those watching this debate and is the truth about the Biden-Harris policies, that when you combine irresponsible fiscal policy in this nation over the past 4 years and an irresponsible monetary policy, what's irresponsible, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that our families are suffering from inflation, the highest in 40 years. It takes $1.21 for what it cost $1 just 4 years ago. The resolution before us changes the direction. It delivers on President Trump's agenda to put the American people first. This resolution does protect the American people from the largest tax increase in American history. And let's set the record straight. The top 1% are paying more in taxes, the most they've ever paid in the history of the country. They pay 45% of all the taxes in this country, and yet the rest of us, at less than that 50%, they're paying the least amount of tax they've ever paid in American history. This bill goes on to support border security and national defense that President Trump campaigned on and Republicans campaigned on, and it reins in wasteful spending. It reduces our long-term debt to GDP, and in the Financial Services Committee, we're pleased to follow the directions of the House Budget Committee and deliver on spending reforms by cutting back one of the most wasteful agencies that we have, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And with that, I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman from Texas Reserve.
Well, Mr. Chairman, upon hearing that the richest 1% of Americans pay 45% in taxes, my heart is breaking. I'll be sure that at church this Sunday we take up an extra collection, but God knows the billions of dollars they're about to get in this budget resolution will certainly help line their pockets. With that, I'm happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Mr. McGarvey.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the Republican budget resolution and urge my colleagues to reject it for what it is, a total scam and betrayal of the middle class. A budget isn't just a policy document. It's a moral document. And in their budget, the Republicans make their moral code clear. The rich get richer, and the rest of us pay for it. There is no reason a teacher in Louisville, Kentucky should pay more in taxes than Tesla did last year. Kentuckians, let's talk about how this budget will hurt you. This budget mandates at least $880 billion of cuts to Medicaid, $230 billion of cuts to take meals away from seniors, veterans, and kids, and at least $330 billion of cuts to our public schools. Let me make this clear for those of you watching from Kentucky. If you are one of the 1.4 million people in the Commonwealth who gets health insurance through Connect, Republicans are coming for your health care. If you have a kid in JCPS, Republicans are coming after their education, fewer teachers, fewer opportunities, and no more free school lunch. If you are one of our veterans or our seniors or the 1 in 5 Kentucky kids going hungry as we speak, Republicans want to take away your next meal. It's wrong. I met with over 1,000 of my constituents this weekend. They're angry. I'm angry too, because this budget hurts people. And for what? So Elon Musk can get even richer? It's a scam. I yield back.
Gentleman, Pennsylvania reserves. Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, also a Budget Committee member who's helped us draft this budget framework, Mr. Chuck Edwards.
Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the great work that our budget chairman has done to bring us to this point today. It's taken him hundreds of hours and tested his blood pressure quite seriously to get us to this point. And I rise today in firm support of this resolution. In November last year, 77 million Americans demanded changes in how our federal government is working for them, particularly in the disastrous policies from the last 4 years. And I plan to help deliver on those demands by fixing how Washington works and implementing President Trump's agenda to make America first. This resolution gives us the framework that we need to meet the demands of those 77 million Americans. Those demands include fixing our border, this crisis once and for all. This resolution does that. Those demands include unleashing American energy. This resolution does that.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chair, I urge strong support for this resolution. Thank you very much.
Reserves.
Mr. Chair, may I inquire as to how much time remains on each side?
15 and a quarter minutes remaining for Pennsylvania.
15 and a quarter on this side?
Right.
Yeah, thank you. And I would remind the gentleman that just spoke, this bill would put 2.8 million people in North Carolina at risk of losing Medicaid. Now with that, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Rhode Island, a distinguished member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Amo.
Mr. Speaker, I ask myself 2 questions on every vote. Who does this benefit? Who does this hurt? Today, the answers are clear. This Republican budget resolution would benefit the richest 1%. Who would it hurt? Working class families struggling to make ends meet. It threatens 3rd graders in my hometown of Pawtucket who rely on the community eligibility provision to eat school breakfast and lunch. It threatens a new mom on Aquidneck Island who needs Medicaid to afford postpartum care. And it threatens seniors in East Providence who depend on Medicaid's home and community-based services to stay connected to their loved ones as they age at home. All of these ordinary Americans would get hurt. For what? To pay for tax cuts for the rich. Don't believe me? Look at the numbers. The Republican plan could slash $230 billion from SNAP and $880 billion from Medicaid. 2 proposals which allow them to turn around, and shovel $1.1 trillion in tax giveaways to the richest 1%. Mr. Speaker, when I first read through this resolution, I thought surely it must be a mistake. There's no way that Republicans would intentionally hurt working Americans, right? Wrong. Democrats tried to stop the madness over and over, but Republicans refused to listen. Just yesterday, Republicans refused to consider my amendment to block cuts to SNAP and programs that provide free and reduced-priced lunches for students. You heard that right. Republicans want to make it harder for hungry children to eat. Republicans also refuse to join me in supporting Medicaid. It provides health coverage to 72 million Americans, including over 300,000 Rhode Islanders. That's not a typo. Republicans are putting the needs of billionaires above the needs of ordinary Americans. If that isn't a betrayal, I don't know what is. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from the Tar Heel State of North Carolina, also Budget Committee member and good friend, Mr. Addison McDowell.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I thank the chairman for yielding. And while we may not agree on whose state has better barbecue, one thing we do agree on is that today is a momentous day, not for one party, but for all Americans. Today, we take a giant step towards fulfilling the mandate given by millions of Americans. For too long, the people's interests have been drowned out by an agenda pursued by elite left-wing politicians. You see, elite left-wing politicians don't feel the impact of their reckless policies, whether it be pursuing open border policies or policies that fuel inflation. It's normal citizens who feel the impact. Today, we start the process of restoring America's strength rather than pursue a reckless ideological joyride agenda. This resolution paves the way for historic investment in our country's border security, permanent tax relief for the middle class, getting rid of the inflation tax that's hit the working class, and rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse throughout our government. Mr. Speaker, Americans demand better. This resolution does that. I urge a yes vote and yield back.
Ms. Expired. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would remind the gentleman this bill would put 2.8 million people in North Carolina at risk of losing Medicaid. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Moskowitz.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, today, Representative Thomas Massie, who is a budget hawk who walks around with the debt clock, which, by the way, I bought, it's $99 on his website, or on a website, talked about today that the Republican budget, if the Republican budget passes, the budget deficit doesn't get better, it gets worse. And then Elon Musk commented, and he said, that sounds bad. Boy, that is awkward. I mean, you know how much we hate it when you guys fight amongst each other. And you know, so that wasn't enough, right? Then Representative Massie went to the meeting, the Republican meeting where the budget was being discussed, and he came out and he said, you know what? They convinced me. They convinced me that he's a no. And the reason he's a no is he said over the next 3 years, it's going to add almost $1 trillion to the debt. And he said, and that's in the most best case, the most rosy scenario. And then he said, that's a lie. Man. You know, so this clock that we have that has the debt, you know, it's still going up. DOGE has not yet reversed it. And I say that as a member of the DOGE caucus who wants to shrink the size of government and cut spending. But this 36, instead of your budget making it a 35, it's going to make it a 37. We're going to go to $37 trillion in debt. And so, look, if you pass this today, this idea about DOGE or the Republicans being fiscal hawks or wanting to cut spending is no longer reality. I yield back. Thank you.
Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I want to remind the gentleman that the last 4 years, President Biden and my Democrat colleagues set a record of $8 trillion added to the national debt. If you add the $5 trillion in interest expense, well, I don't know that anybody's going to ever accomplish that feat. That's $8.5 trillion borrowed a day. And during that reign of reckless spending, they added $116,000 to the debt burden that our children will bear into the future. With that, I recognize and yield 2 minutes of time to my friend from California, also a Budget Committee member, Mr. Jay Obernolte.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my chairman of the Budget Committee and my friend from Texas for yielding. Mr. Speaker, this year we will borrow almost $2 trillion, which represents almost a third of all federal spending. For the first time in the history of our country this year, we will spend more on interest paying the national debt that we have already borrowed. And in several years, 3/4 of all federal borrowing will be just to pay interest on the money that we have already borrowed. Several years after that, we won't even have enough money to pay the interest on the national debt, which will signal a devastating default for our country. Mr. Speaker, we cannot allow that to happen. And yet, Mr. Speaker, we have a spending problem. We do not have a revenue problem. Last year, we collected more dollars in federal tax revenue than ever in the history of our country. That's why this budget resolution is so important. It starts us finally down the path of reducing federal spending rather than increasing federal spending, and it does it without increasing taxes on hardworking Americans. That's why I'm proud to urge a yes vote. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would remind the gentleman this bill would put 13.4 million people in California at risk of losing Medicaid. With that, Mr. Chair, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Vermont, a great member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Balint.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to the Republican budget. Here's the deal. Republicans have the House, they have the Senate, they have the White House, and they could be passing legislation to actually make your lives better, to lower costs on groceries, on prescription drugs. They could be lowering the cost of housing. But instead, they are attacking the very programs that working and middle-class families rely on this country. It is a betrayal. We were sent here, all of us, we were sent here to work on behalf of the people back home. We were sent here to lower costs for people, to alleviate suffering. And I know that my colleagues were as well. Lecturing us about the debt when they know full well that their math is not mathing. They are adding to the deficit. I vote on this Republican budget, I will be thinking of all the working families back home in Vermont, people who sent me here to work on their behalf, not against them. I'm thinking of families who worry that they won't have Head Start. I'm thinking about the people who Thank you so much. I'm thinking about the small businesses in Vermont who have reached out to me to say that Trump's proposed tax war with Canada, tariff war, is going to crush them. I'm thinking about the 150,000 Vermonters who are dependent on Medicaid. I urge my colleagues to reject this unfair budget, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield a minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Glenn Grothman, also my colleague on the House Budget Committee.
Thank you very much. I think I have to address some of the things that I think are out of line or misspoke. with regard to the other party today. First of all, I want to point out there are not a lot of details in this budget. The budget has a lot of top-line numbers in which we try to keep tax cuts that went into effect 8 years ago in effect because we need a strong economy with high employment. But there are no specific cuts in here. The frustrating thing I hear from the other side is that they're taking out that any cut or any reduction in spending is a problem. Let me remind people, 26% of the current level spending for the current year is borrowed. That should be of huge concern to everybody. The average American has about $100,000 their share of a debt. Think of that. A family of four has $400,000 in their share of the debt. The average person or the average American in the budget coming up this year will be spending about $20,000.
I yield the gentleman another 15 seconds.
Just follow up one more time. Remember, America has to know that 26% of every Social Security dollar, 26% of every new tank, 20% of every new education dollar is borrowed. And at a time where interest costs are going up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would remind the gentleman this bill would put 1.2 million people in the Badger State at risk of losing Medicaid. With that, I'm very happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, distinguished member of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, Ms. Presley.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise on behalf of the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District as the House prepares to vote on a truly horrifying Republican budget resolution, one void of empathy or common sense. I'm thinking of and censoring the people in my district who stand to be harmed the most. Families in Mattapan who receive their health care through Mass Health, the Medicaid program for Massachusetts. Mothers in Chelsea who rely on SNAP to feed their babies. Disabled veterans in Randolph who receive life-saving care and benefits through the VA. Families in Roxbury who rely on Head Start for childcare. This Republican majority said they'd spend the next 2 years cutting costs for the middle class, but the only thing they're cutting is trillions of dollars from life-saving programs our communities depend on to make ends meet. Mr. Speaker, this has never been about efficiency. Tell me how it is efficient to make people across this country sicker, hungrier, poorer, more vulnerable. Tell me how it is efficient to buy more toy rockets for Donald Trump's billionaire friends while parents can't afford groceries. The cruelty is the point. What a callous shame and a sham. I urge my colleagues to stand with the people, protect families, and reject this shameful budget resolution. In the words of a righteous faith leader whose place of worship Donald Trump recently attended, have mercy. Thank you. I yield.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think God had mercy on this country, and he's given us a shot now to turn this country around and to give it back to the American people and to return to common sense policies, to put the American people first and to clean up the mess in Washington, D.C. And we've seen the exposure of the waste and the woke and the bloat, and it's immoral to hand our country like this to the next generation. We're long overdue to get our fiscal house in order, Mr. Chairman. And the American people deserve to keep more of their money. The American people deserve fiduciaries in Congress that will take care to steward their tax dollars. And the people who need these programs that we created for the most vulnerable, they deserve to have the programs without having folks siphon off monies or people ineligible draining those programs. We got a lot of work to do. We won't be intimidated by the rhetoric. We won't be scared into paralysis anymore as a Republican Party. We're standing up with our president and fearless leader, Mr. Donald J. Trump, And we know the American people are behind us 100%. We're leaning in, and we're going to save this country, and we're going to give our children a fighting chance at the blessings of liberty and the land of opportunity. With that, I yield 2 minutes to my good friend, who is a